Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. So I was chatting with a friend last weekend about the concept of governance in technology. Now, she and I both live in the world of digital identity and standards, and in the parts of AI that touch those areas. So naturally, this was the sort of conversation that happened over food and wine. Entirely reasonable amounts of both, of course. So what we observed is that when people in our field talk about governance, the context really matters. Because you've got governance in the whole identity governance and administration, or IGA field, which is not the same thing as governance in AI governance in terms of like what they do. So they are related, of course, and they overlap, and they both involve risk and control and accountability, process and evidence. But they're not interchangeable. So naturally, we use the same word for both. Technology has never met a useful term it could not overload. Now, this is not just a terminology complaint, though I reserve the right to complain about terminology whenever the industry earns it. I might even call that job security at this point. But when it comes to talking about governance, terminology matters because organizations are increasingly using AI to help with IGA. So AI systems recommend access changes, they flag risky entitlements, identify outliers, suggest role models, automate review workflows, and sometimes operate as conversational agents that can trigger identity-related actions. Well, at that point, we're not merely governing access. We're governing the system that helps decide access. It's like turtles all the way down, for sure. It's just like different species of turtle as you go. So in enterprise identity, right, governance is generally shaped by IGA. But that's not the only kind of governance, right? In digital identity, you've got federation governance, you've got wallet ecosystem governance, you've got trust frameworks governance, assurance, metadata, standards governance, they all exist. And each of these brings their own lovely box of policy, process, responsibility, and edge cases. But in enterprise IAM, IGA has done a lot to define what governance sounds like in practice, right? IGA is concerned specifically with questions like who has access, who approved that access, does it violate policy, is it still needed, can we show the auditor a report, and then go lay down. So this is governance as operational control. It's tied to identity lifecycle management, provisioning, deprovisioning, join, remover, leaver workflows, role management, entitlement reviews, segregation of duties, policy enforcement, audit trails, and compliance evidence. All of these things are probably familiar. So it's not usually like abstract or philosophical. It is not asking whether a system is aligned with humans flourishing in their lives. It is asking whether someone in finance still has access to a production database that they last touched during the Obama administration. I mean, that's a valid and necessary form of governance in that it prevents real risk, it creates evidence, and it gives security, compliance, and business teams a way to make access decisions less ad hoc and more reviewable. But it is also bounded, right? IGA governance tends to focus on the access decisions and the processes around that decision. It is largely about constraining and evidencing access, the identities, accounts, roles, entitlements, approvals, exceptions, and reviews that make up enterprise access control. Now, that boundedness is part of why IGA is useful. It turns governance into workflows, into rules and dashboards and certifications and reports, right? It gives the organization something to operate. It also means that people who are steeped in IGA may hear governance and think first of control execution, the policies, the approvals, the reviews, the audits, and the remediations, which is not at all wrong. It's just not the whole picture, right? AI governance comes from a completely different problem space. AI governance is not primarily about whether Alice should have access to application X. It's about how an AI system is designed and trained, evaluated, deployed, monitored, constrained, corrected, and eventually retired. It asks whether the system behaves in ways that are legal and ethical, reliable and explainable, and aligned with an organization's obligations and values. That's a much wider frame, and it does, in fact, start getting into a bit of the abstract and philosophical. It includes data provenance, it includes model behavior and testing and risk management. It includes oversight and transparency and accountability. I mean, it includes a whole lot. So, in other words, AI governance is not only about the decision, it's about the socio-technical system that it produces or shapes the decision. And that's where our vocabulary starts to creak a bit, right? In IGA, governance often lands as an implementation discipline. In AI, governance often arrives as an organizational aspiration, a policy framework, or a regulatory anxiety that has been cloaked in PowerPoint. The field is still working out how to turn principles into repeatable controls. Everyone agrees that AI should be fair and accountable, transparent, safe, privacy preserving, explainable, and human centered. Excellent. I really look forward to a JIRA ticket that says, make the system more human centered. I'm sure there is one somewhere. I mean, the serious point is that AI governance is broader, but not necessarily more operationally mature, right? IGA has a narrow object, but relatively concrete machinery. AI governance has a broad object, but often a weaker operational translation. And so the difference can make some conversations a little awkward. One person will say governance and mean an access certification workflow. Another says governance and means life cycle model for ensuring AI systems meet legal, ethical, or organizational requirements. I mean, both are using the word governance correctly, and yet they're not talking about the same thing. AI is increasingly being used inside identity systems and IGA products too, right? Sometimes this is relatively contained to anomaly detection or peer group analysis or entitlement recommendations, prioritization of access reviews, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's a little bit more ambitious, right? An AI assistant that helps users request access or helps managers approve or deny access or helps admins interpret policy. And on paper, this is probably very appealing. It looks like there's a whole industry forming around this because IGA can be painful. Access reviews are often tedious and bloated and they're performative. They don't actually accomplish what they set out to do. Managers approve things they don't understand. Entitlement names look like they were assembled by a raccoon walking across a keyboard, right? Role models drift, exceptions multiply, review fatigue is real. AI promises to make this better by identifying patterns and summarizing risk and recommending removals or explaining access. And that's not inherently bad, and it can be very useful. But the governance burden has changed. If an AI system recommends that a user's access be removed, the organization still needs to know whether the access decision is right. And that's the familiar IGA question. But now it also needs to know why the AI made the recommendation. What data did it use? Was that data current and appropriate? Does the model perform differently across groups, departments, geographies, or worker categories? Do reviewers understand the recommendation or do they simply accept it because the system sounded confident? Can the recommendation be challenged? Can it be reversed? And can the organization explain the decisions later? Those are AI governance questions. If an AI agent can take action inside an IGA platform, the organization has an even bigger problem. It must decide what authority the agent has, whose authority it is exercising, what tools it can call, what APIs it can touch, what approvals are required, and what happens when it goes wrong. Which is not just AI governance, that's identity governance applied to an AI enabled actor. The organization has to govern the access outcome, the AI mediated process, and the delegated authority of the AI component itself. So apparently, one governance stack was just not enough. We need layers. Now, a simple way to separate the two meanings here is this, right? IGA governance is primarily about constraining and evidencing access decisions. AI governance is primarily about constraining and evidencing socio-technical system behavior. And when AI is used to perform or recommend IGA actions, both are in scope. Now, making this distinction helps avoid a couple bad assumptions. The first bad assumption is that because an AI feature lives inside an IGA product or ordinary IGA controls are sufficient, because they may not be. Access logs and approval records do not necessarily explain whether the AI system was appropriately trained, tested, monitored, secured, or constrained. And the second bad assumption is that because AI governance exists in a broader field, identity-specific controls become secondary. Also, no. If an AI system can influence who gets access, identity governance remains central. The organization still needs least privilege, separation of duties, lifecycle controls, approval boundaries, access evidence, and remediation. That overlap is not replacing either discipline, it's making both actually a lot more necessary. Now, when AI enters IGA, organizations should ask a whole bunch more precise questions than does it have governance? That question is practically an invitation to receive a confident but useless answer, right? I have a bunch of questions you can ask your teams. There's a lot more in the written blog. I'm going to highlight 6 here. 1, you should be asking, what decisions or recommendations does the AI system actually make? 2, can an AI take action or does it only advise? 3, what evidence is retained for an audit? 4, can a user, manager, or administrator challenge the recommendation? 5, how is the AI system monitored after deployment? And 6, what happens when the model, policy, or organizational structure changes? None of these are like anti-AI questions. They are more like pro not being surprised later questions. Now, I don't think the problem is that identity people use governance incorrectly, right? In many cases, IGA has made governance unusually concrete. There's something rather refreshing about a field where governance can mean here's the policy, here's the workflow, here's the approval, here's the evidence, here's the revocation. Nor do I think AI governance is just vague hand-waving. That broader frame is necessary because AI systems do not merely execute deterministic rules. They classify, they infer and recommend, generate, summarize, and sometimes act in ways that are probabilistic and context-dependent. They can create new accountability gaps even when they are embedded in familiar enterprise systems. The problem is how some people and organizations flatten both to use one generic bucket called governance and assume everyone means the same thing when they really, really don't, right? In IGA, governance is asking whether the access is appropriate, controlled, reviewable, or evidenced. In AI, the governance is asking whether the system shaping the outcome is lawful, reliable, accountable, etc., right? And when AI is used for IGA, the organization has to ask both sets of questions at once. That may be actually a little bit inconvenient. It may slow down your slideware. It may reduce the number of times someone can say AI-powered governance before lunch. So sad. But if we are going to keep reusing the same word across different technical and organizational contexts, we do owe ourselves a little bit of precision. Governance is not magic dust, right? It's not a feature label. It is not a synonym for the product as a dashboard. It is a commitment to define what is being controlled, who is accountable, what evidence exists, what risks are being managed, and what happens when the system gets it wrong. And in the overlap between IGA and AI, that commitment has to cover both the access decision and the machine-shaped path that got us there. Something for you to think about. Thanks you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague, and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.